the impacts on Africa. With me, as usual, is our regular guest, Comrade Milton Allimadi. You know him well from being the author of Manufacturing Hates, the book which inspired this program. How are
Yes,
you,
and
sir?
just an update. I got my copyright back last week, so
Yeah,
we're gonna
congratulations.
be in business. Thank you.
Congratulations. So first things first, how is it on the animal farm that is the United States of America?
No, we are living at a time
Mm,
comparable to when people started seeing tremendous change in the fortunes of Great Britain,
mm,
and it took a while for Britain to adjust to its new global
reality.
status. And the United States is going through that process right now.
Okay.
As you know, other powers have emerged. China is a global power now. Countries like Brazil,
Turkey.
India, Turkey, all rising. And eventually Africa will as well, because at the end of the day, that's where the Fort Knox of the world resides, in Africa.
Yeah, yeah, very much so, very much so. And yeah, thinking of how the United States has impacted the world, we cannot but talk about the tariffs regime that
Mhm.
was served to the world. And the man made a grandstanding of it. And the immediate impact of it has been felt in far places as Lesotho, which is where we go to for our first news article stemming from The Guardian. And I'll share. And it goes Lesotho, the only job I know. Tiny Lesotho's garment workers reel from Trump's 50% tariffs. And the news comes from The Guardian. It reads, impoverished African country hit by highest tariff rate, overturning decades of global trade policy. And it goes into it. And the story is filed in Johannesburg by Rachel Savage and Majarata Latelu in Maseru, Maseru being the capital of Lesotho. The day after Donald Trump announced sweeping global tariffs, Lesotho's garment workers feared for their jobs. Last year, Lesotho sent about 20% of its $1.1 billion, $845 million worth of exports to the United States. Most of it clothing under a continent-wide trade agreement meant to help African countries develop via tariff-free exports as well as diamonds. Now, all is at risk after US President imposed a 50% tariff on the impoverished landlocked country, which he claimed last month nobody has ever heard of. Your initial thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's building up, but obviously it's going to be a huge hit on the country, because if you are putting 50% tariffs on Lesotho, it means that its export of garments are going to be transferred. Lesotho is not paying the tariffs, by the way. It's American consumers, because now the price, once it reaches the United States, is going to be assessed that tax rate. You see?
Yeah.
Where a tariff is a form of tax. So let's say the value of let's say $100 million, right?
Yeah.
So now you're going to slap an additional $50 million to that once it reaches the U.S. in terms of the cost to the U.S. consumers.
Yep.
So how it impacts Lesotho is that American consumers are going to turn away from that product, right?
Correct.
Meaning there will no longer be a market for that product in the United States. And that is where it impacts Lesotho in terms of the labor of the workers will no longer be required in the factories, because suddenly that particular market is now gone, because consumers are abandoning the product because of the increased cost, the increased price due to the tariffs. And as a result, people will, if it materializes that way, people on the ground in Lesotho would indeed end up losing their jobs unless that same bundle of exports, a new market can be found for it.
Okay. I'll continue. And it goes on. Makasuti Moeti moved to Lesotho capital, Maseru, from the rural center of the tiny mountainous kingdom, entirely surrounded by South Africa. Factory is the only job I have known for many years, said Moeti, who is who is attached who attaches label to Gap clothing. If the factory is shut, I would not have many options left. I will be forced to return home to the very poverty I thought I had escaped when I moved to the city. And it goes on. On Wednesday, Trump unveiled what he claimed was reciprocal tariffs, overturning decades of global trade policies. The, the tariff rates, which were due to come into force on April 9, ranges from 10% to 50% and were calculated with what economists labeled an idiotic formula, penalizing countries that have the highest trade surpluses with the US relative to their imports from the United States. Now, judging the fact that we have people as, economists ascribing idiocy to the idea of how it was calculated, do you think that would bear any impact on the government, or they just basically, as
On
they
which
will say,
government? On which government?
the United States government?
No, it will, because look, it's called idiotic because that's not how you evaluate these things, correct?
Correct.
You
Yeah.
can't say, I'm going to look at the total exports that the US has to country A, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the total imports that the US has from country A, right?
Yeah.
Which means the exports of country A to the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is imports by the US from country A.
Correct.
You can't say, I'm just going to look at that and see if it's balanced, right?
Yeah.
I can't say, I'm doing business with Adesoji. I buy $100 worth of goods from Adesoji,
Mm-hmm.
and Adesoji also buys $100 worth of goods from Milton. So we are good. And then I'm going to go to Patrick, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mohammed, right?
Correct.
Or Mari, right?
Correct.
And I'm going to say, okay, they export $200 worth of products to Milton.
Mm-hmm.
And does Milton also export $200 million worth of goods to these three individuals?
Nope.
You can't evaluate that way. And let me tell you why.
Go on.
There's some things that Milton does not produce, right?
Correct.
The US imports a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
Because the US, of course, it has its own oil reserves, but it wants to eat up Saudi Arabia's first.
Yeah.
So are you going to tell me that you are going to evaluate and set your tax rate relative to Saudi Arabia dependent on how much of goods that they also import from the United States?
No, highly unlikely.
Even if they don't need it? Let's say I need $1 billion worth of oil from Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
I'm going to punish them because they don't import $1 billion worth of goods from the United States, even though they may not want the goods, but I want their oil. You see what I'm saying?
Correct. Correct.
So you cannot evaluate trade on that basis. And that's why it's going to start backfiring at a particular point. The goods that the US has, that's only one part of it, right? The
Correct.
goods that the US needs because it does not produce or have access to. Okay?
Okay.
So that's only one part of the equation. The other part is that you can't just evaluate physical products, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you say the US has a deficit with China, because they're just looking at the physical merchandise that China sells to the US, and the US sells to China, right?
Correct.
And then Trump is not happy because it's not balanced.
Mm.
But you're not counting the investment that China sends to the US in terms of the treasury bills that it buys. China is
Mm.
one of the world's leading investors in terms of buying US treasuries, right? At
Correct.
one point, I think it was around $2 trillion.
Worth of,
I
yeah.
think it's slightly under $1 trillion. That is a form of export from China as well, you see?
Correct.
So you can't just assess it on physical goods alone. So, I remember years ago, people accused, I think it was Reagan of, voodoo economics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now this guy is coming out with his own brand. There's no label for it yet. You know, I guess maybe the Guardian article is suggesting that this is idiocy economics,
Yeah, yeah.
based on the term it's using.
I mean, that's one way of looking at it.
Mm.
I would continue. It says Lesotho, which has a population of 2.3 million. Could up could you put that into context? How many states in the United States is that?
2.3 million, I think. Is that the population of my city, Washington? Maybe slightly more than my, but it's suddenly New
Of
York City.
DC.
New York
Okay.
City, dwarfs the entire population of that country
Can
by,
you
almost 3 to 4 times, right?
So that population has now been hit by a 50% tariff. So I'll
Right.
continue. So Lesotho, we has a population of 2.3 million, was hit with the highest rate in Africa. It was followed by Madagascar, a vanilla exporter with a tariff of 47%, Botswana, a diamond producer on 37%, oil-rich Angola with 32%, and the continent's most industrialized economy, South Africa, on 30%.
Mm.
Now, the final part would take, then I'll take your thoughts. Is there are over 30,000 garment workers in Lesotho, mostly women, with 12,000 making clothes for US brands including Levi's, Calvin Klein, and Walmart in Chinese and Taiwanese owned factories. While most of the jobs pay monthly minimum wages of $146 to $163. They are highly sought after in the poor and largely informal economy. So, judging by the fact that this tariffs is likely to impact women in an impoverished economy, what do you see?
Well, I mean, I don't know from whose perspective. I mean, from the U.S. president
No,
perspective, we know
I'm now looking. I'm looking from the African perspective.
it has an adverse negative impact on many respects because, first of all,
Hmm.
you know, and I hate to be biased against my brothers, but women take care of the household, you see,
Correct.
very much more efficiently, you see. So it's going to diminish the welfare of the children as well, directly. It's going to have negative impact on the evolution of the social structure because if you have women employed,
Mhm.
they're getting away from the so-called kitchen, so to speak,
Yeah.
and they're evolving in society. You see,
Mm-hmm.
so it's going to set that back tremendously well. So that, of course, is terrible. But the story also reveals something which is, of course, very, very disturbing. That they're producing the merchandise in Chinese and Taiwanese owned factories.
I knew you weren't going to miss that.
That is just terrible and tragic because it means that they are only the program that allows African countries to export under AGOA, African, what is it called? Growth and Opportunity Act. I think that's the name of that
Yeah.
congressional legislation. Particularly, it's focused on trying to promote manufacturing in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, historically, a one gateway to manufacturing has been textiles industry historically all over the world, right?
Correct. Correct. Yep.
It's typically been the easiest one to start and then evolve from there to other products. So now you're telling me that those factories are actually not owned by the people, the citizens of Lesotho. That's terrible. And it suggests to me that that situation is probably duplicated in many African countries that are right now supposed to be benefiting from this AGOA legislation. It means they're only retaining a minuscule of the profit, right? In other words,
And the
Lesotho
wages
is
as well.
benefiting basically by the government probably taxing the owners of the factory, taxing the salary of the employees, and the employees benefiting by having jobs, right? But the bulk of the profit from the actual textile that is exported to the US, millions of dollars, that is going to end up being retained by the Chinese and Taiwanese owners of those factories. That's abysmal. That's something that needs to be dealt with in every African country. And you know what? This reminds me exactly of what Samir Amin said in a lecture that's on YouTube. Not a lecture, interview. It's called Africa's Industrialization Challenge. And he said, you can have industries without being industrialized. And this is exactly what he's talking about. You know, you have factories, but the factories are not even owned by the citizens of your country. And that's a big problem.
Okay. One final question on that. So, I mean, you've just pointed out to what Samir Amil spoke about there, and this will probably go on back of it, and it will point to Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is how can African countries develop independent and resilient economies that are not overtly, directly or indirectly dependent on Western markets?
Well, it's difficult because it has to be a concerted policy because they're going to be very aggressive against you, very hostile to the extent of even, you know, eliminating you, as we saw with Thomas Sankara. But so it needs dedicated and serious leaders. You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
You have 5 leaders of the caliber and dedication of a Sankara, they can do it collectively. They will say that in this region, Burkina Faso will grow the cotton. Mali will have the factories. They'll be located in Mali, you see? The factories are in Mali. Let's say 3 countries are involved. Mali will provide 40% of the employees. The other 2 countries can provide 30% of the employees. Okay. You see?
Okay.
So now you're creating an industry for producing cotton. You have factories now where employees are having relatively skilled labor producing the clothes. You're creating jobs that are almost evenly distributed, benefiting all the 3 countries participating in this joint agreement. And you have 3 leaders involved. And it's to go back to the warning provided by Sankara. It's very difficult to kill 3 leaders at the same time, you see? Right? So that's just for textiles and cotton. Now you pick another product. Let's say you have coltan or you have cobalt. You're saying the same kind of arrangement. The cobalt is located in Mali. That's where the mines are. Okay. The other countries don't have that, right?
Correct.
The mining company is going to be owned jointly by those 3 countries. They each put in 33% subscription. and they invest and they get the technology needed. If they need to hire expatriate managers initially who will train domestic people, you do that, but you own the factories, you see? You own the mine, you own the factory and the mining company. The expertise, you can hire. I mean, even the World Bank, even international institutions hire experts from all over the world, right?
Correct.
You hire them. Now, you are not producing the cobalt and exporting it as cobalt. No, you're going to manufacture batteries for electric cars within these three countries.
Factories. Okay.
And export it to the countries now that produce the electric cars. As your economy grows, at some point, you start producing electric cars within these three countries. Whether it's 3 countries, 4 countries, 500, it can be done on a regional basis. East Africa, we have Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi. We have Congo, powerful Congo with all its resources.
Yeah.
In West Africa, you can have the same arrangement. In South Africa, you have SADC, South Africa, and all those other regional countries. It can be done. Very easy. But they need to have the same vision, same dedication, and they should not allow one single country to undermine them. If one leader is trying to sell them out, they should cause trouble for that leader. And if they outnumber him or her, they can encourage the people of that particular country to get rid of that leader. No, really, they need to be like that because that's how the Europeans are. They don't play games when it comes to their interest. So we have to become serious as well. Otherwise, we won't survive as a people.
So speaking of survival, and someone's probably listening to the advice you just gave, I'll go to the likes of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Chad for our next story, which is filed in by Radio Deutsche Welle, the German news organization. And it says, it reads that the Sahel junta drive new era in mineral extraction. The story is filed in by Marty Shivoski. In Niger, a local company has been granted a license to mine copper. Meanwhile, military governments in Mali and Burkina Faso aim to reduce dependence on foreign mining companies and diversify their economies. And it goes further. It says Niger wants to boost its economy and expand its mining industry by mining copper in the Agadez region. The country granted a permit to national firm Compagnie Minière del Ner. Niger is continuing its program of diversifying mining production with a move that marks its entry into the restricted circle of countries producing this strategic mineral, according to a statement from the military government, which took power following a 2023 coup. Ulf Leeson, head of Konrad Adenauer Foundation Sahel's regional program in neighboring Mali, said the concession is part of Niger's strategy to reduce its reliance on foreign companies for mineral extraction. He said that it's impossible to predict how successful the project would be. The copper mine is in the north, not far from Libya, where the security situation is poor, he noted, adding that Niger is following a trend seen in Burkina and Mali, where military governments rely more on local companies rather than Western ones. Your initial thoughts?
Well, that precisely is what I was alluding to. These countries are embarking on economic liberation, economic independence. Many African countries got the paper independence in the 1960s, formal independence. But as we know, it is impossible to be politically independent if you're not economically independent. See?
Okay.
Here is the worst, but best example. If African sisters and brothers who are listening to us, watching us, do not recognize what I mean when I talk about Africa's total dependency, right?
Mm.
Can you imagine producing something that you don't consume just because you want to export it and earn dollars or euros, right? Foreign currency, they call it, and the impact it has on your economy when the demand for that product
Drops.
suddenly declines or disappears. So you're producing cocoa, cotton, coffee, tobacco, you name it,
Flowers.
flowers, products that you cannot consume. And then the market crashes and you've not been producing food. And now you have less money. You can't even buy food. And you had abandoned growing food when in fact you have land to grow your own food.
Correct.
What happens? Famine, right?
Yep.
You cannot grow your economy based on the demand for your products by outside consumers. Because it means if they no longer want to consume your products, or best case scenario, they do not want to consume your products now because of the kind of tariffs that Trump is setting up, what are you going to do? The first story already told us. People are talking about the possibility of starving, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is why any rational economic system, I don't care whether you say you're a capitalist or socialist or what have you, the number one requirement is for you to produce to satisfy the needs of your domestic citizens, your country. Anything else must become secondary to that dictate. And that's how you build your economy, you see? So I like the fact that Niger even said, you know what? We're not using the uranium ourselves anyway, right?
Yep.
Number one. Number two, we're getting paid pennies by France.
Mm-hmm.
We might miss those pennies a little bit, but in the long run, it's worth biting the bullet to do the right thing, right?
Yep.
Eventually, we'll get someone willing to pay the price that we're demanding for our uranium and for our other minerals. Number one. Number two, why should we be dependent on foreign mining companies extracting these resources from the ground? It's not nuclear physics. Let's support the creation of our own companies. And as I said earlier, if you need expertise, pay for that. So long as you own the factory, the mining company, the entity yourself. And I'm glad to see that that is a strategy they are now embarking on. And that strategy should be duplicated in all African countries. I mean, when we come to mineral resources, it has environmental impact, right?
Correct.
But that's a discussion that we can have at another time for another show. So long as you're producing these minerals and extracting them, why should you let Total of France be doing that in Mozambique, for example? Or even the oil in Uganda, for example. And of course, that's one of the reasons why Gaddafi was killed. In addition to wanting to create the African currency backed by Libyan gold.
Yeah.
The other reason why they had resented him for decades was because Libya's oil was produced by Libya's national oil company.
Yeah.
It didn't have Total, it didn't have ExxonMobil, it didn't have British Petroleum or Shell. No, it was a Libyan company. And that is how they were able to retain the substantial part of the profit and build up the magnificent cities and schools and roads and bridges in Libya and give people free education through university, free healthcare, and all that stuff.
All of which has
And
subsequently
that
been
is
destroyed.
what, sorry?
I said all of which has subsequently been laid waste to.
Oh, absolutely. They never forgave him for that. So while they were saying, oh, we are coming in to prevent Gaddafi from killing his own people, they bombed the country 24/7 for 10 months and probably killed tens of times more Libyans than Gaddafi could have ever killed. You see? Obviously, they wanted to take back control of the oil production.
Correct.
But in their desperate, reckless policy, destroyed the whole country. Now nobody is benefiting from the oil. You see?
Okay. One more part from this. There's a part where, yeah. So when it comes to job creation, Mr. Leeson says the operators of the mine located in Niger's second largest city, Moradi, expect to produce an average of 2,700 tons of copper per year over a period of 10 years. Niger's government hopes that the mine will create hundreds of new jobs and a lucrative business. Copper is currently traded on the world market at $9,700, which is 8,789 euros per ton. A small-scale permit has been granted to Nigerian company Compagnie Minière de Recherche for Adenat to produce lithium, a key component of the rechargeable lithium-ion batteries that power everything from cell phones to electric vehicles. The company expects to produce 300 tons of lithium a year. The Nigerian state holds a 25% stake in the Cominair copper mine and a 40% stake in Comirex in order to maintain the government's control over the nature's resources. So, I mean, you pointed out the fact that this is the people's wealth being traded for pennies. Clearly, these three governments, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have realized the value that has been lost over the years and are trying to recoup.
Thank you for saying that, because that's something I had meant to touch on.
Go on.
And I totally forgot. Any negotiations with any of these foreign companies that had been exploiting, if they want to come back in some capacity, of course, maybe as minority partners, because if they're going to be providing technological skills, then you may still want to negotiate with them. But any return should also be predicated on refunding some of the excess profit that they accumulated over the many, many years. And since many of the products that these countries have are kind of unique, they're not found all over the world. Don't be surprised. Some of them might listen and say, okay, let's talk. It doesn't have to be paid in a lump sum. But let's say you agree that, yeah, we retained $1 billion illegally. Yeah, spread the payment back over 10 years, you know? Pay us, 10 or 20 years, pay us 50 million a year or something.
Okay.
As refund for that.
So one final question with regards
we have to be very creative. We have to be very creative as African people. We have to start thinking outside the box. Let's maximize what we can get from the people that owe us, you see?
Okay. One question, while reading this was, I mean, we've tabled this question over and over again, but sometimes it's a recurring theme, so one needs to beat the drum, as it were. How do African governments balance sovereignty, investment needs, and technological gap in welcoming foreign investments?
Well, obviously, we have to set our investment agenda first. We have to set our priorities. What are our priorities? And I think for most African countries, the priorities should be actually what many of them had in the 1960s. Education, right? Education, because education allows you to transform the people who will transform Africa.
Yeah.
If every individual is transformed through the benefits of education, then your chances of transforming the entire country and the entire continent, which itself we want to end up being one country anyway, is tremendously enhanced. You see, number one, then of course infrastructure. You know,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
we need to invest in infrastructure. You can't have a country like Congo, all its mineral resources. Part of the problem why there's incentive by, and of course I'm not condoning it. These are criminals,
Yeah.
these multinationals, criminals who are sponsoring the terrorism from Uganda and Rwanda against Eastern Congo is because it's easier to extract those resources from Eastern Congo and then use the infrastructure in Uganda and Rwanda to get them to the international market.
Okay.
Rwanda and Uganda, even with all the economic problems they have better roads and better infrastructure than Congo does. You see? So that's one of the things. Obviously, first things first, we need to make sure that these invading troops are expelled from Congo and Congo gets back its sovereignty and total control of its territory. But then after that, Congo needs to embark on a massive infrastructure building, roads, railways, airports, so that it becomes easier to extract those resources and go through the proper channel
to get them to
Kinshasa and outside the country. You see? I mean, after all, it's not like Congo is the one that has access to the sea. Uganda and Rwanda are landlocked countries. So it's not like they have any advantage. They just have an advantage in that they have better roads, right? Than Congo. And they have better propaganda. You know, they have better propaganda. They've been able to disguise this genocidal war that they've been conducting on behalf of multinationals
as some sort of rebellion.
Domestic rebellion, or us going in to rescue, Tutsi who are being massacred by the central government, all propaganda, you see. But Congo also seems to be doing a little better now in countering the propaganda, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so obviously the investment needs to benefit the recipient country and take care of my needs. And then, but your profit cannot be the number one concern. If the investment is going to have significant adverse environmental negative impact, of course, I don't want it, you see? But then you have to have a serious, you can imagine, Thomas Sankara would not accept that, right?
Correct.
But we have many unscrupulous leaders who would accept it. They would take the money, even if, there's a very interesting documentary. It's called, I think it's called Why African Poverty. I think maybe that's a subtitle.
Okay.
But it's very interesting, and it shows the environmental destruction in Zambia over the copper production in one location. I mean, the company is making, 1 year we're exporting like billions of dollars worth of copper. But
that's Glencore. That's Glencore.
Glencore, yes, absolutely. Glencore. It was producing, even the color of the rain had changed because of the chemicals.
The dust,
being emanated to the atmosphere, right? Everybody in that community was falling sick, right?
Yeah.
Intestinal, abdominal pains, vomiting, and all that, The government that doesn't care is just going to be counting the money. And in fact, the government, it reveals how government can be so destructive to Africa's interest, that particular documentary. It showed in 1 year where the Glencore made billions of dollars, right? The government, not only did it not make any money, but it ended up owing Glencore money because it had accepted an electricity rate, which ended up resulting in
Deficit.
negative income for the government because
Whoa.
the rates were so preposterously low, right? That the government ended up having to pay for it and pay at least I don't know whether they were paid, but they ended up owing $150 million to Glencore. You see? So we need to have governments that are serious, not just looking to line their own pockets. You see?
Mm. Mm.
Right.
Yeah. And speaking of government who care about their people, for the next story, we go to Senegal. And Senegal was in the news, and the news comes from the AP. And it reads, Senegal revises amnesty law that covered deadly protests. The story is filed by Mark Bacheria and Babacar Dion. It reads, Senegal's parliament approved revision to a law passed under the former president that granted amnesties for offenses committed during the deadly opposition protest in West Africa. The law was passed in March 2024, shortly before the presidential election, and granted amnesty for offenses by both security forces and protesters during violent demonstrations between 2021 and 2024. Right groups Amnesty International said at least 65 people were killed during the clashes. Your initial thoughts at the revision? Does it sound familiar?
All right. So, yeah, of course it does. But here's the deal. When you have a law like that, right?
Yeah.
It sounds familiar in the sense that it's very close to home here in the US. So in this particular case, right?
Okay.
When you hear something like that,
Mm-hmm.
you know that the primary beneficiary is going to be the security forces.
Security forces, correct.
And obviously when they say, oh, both sides, no, both sides didn't have those kind of weapons, you see?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it means how many members of security forces were killed? How many civilians were killed? You see?
Mm.
So the balance of violence is going to weigh against the security forces as having perpetrated the violence against civilians.
Correct.
So you can't have a law that treats both sides as perps and equally. You see?
Mm.
I believe any such amnesty should be properly calibrated. You see?
Mm.
If you have a protest, it's organized as a peaceful protest, one or two particular people involved in the protest go out of their way and they harm security personnel who are there to enforce the peace, because even peaceful protests are supervised, you see,
Correct.
so that they don't get out of hand,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So the police that conduct themselves properly, those are fine.
Mm-hmm.
And you have others that go out of their way as well and they commit violence.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So those should be punished as well.
Mm.
And the punish should be consistent with the crime that was committed. You see?
Correct.
So in theory, I have no objection to the concept itself. You see?
To the concept of granting amnesty to both sides? Is that what you mean?
I have no concept. I have no qualm with that.
Okay.
But I'm saying,
Mm-hmm.
if members of security forces committed
Went out of their
crimes,
way.
and that's
Okay.
why it has to be calibrated. You cannot have a blanket amnesty.
Mm-hmm.
You see?
Mm-hmm.
Because a blanket amnesty then, of course, would exonerate crimes.
Correct.
And then what happens next time? You have to grant it again because you granted it in the past.
Correct.
What is your
Correct.
reason for denying it if it happens in the future? So blanket amnesty, I oppose.
Okay. Okay. I'll continue. So it goes on. Rights groups and lawyers criticized the law because it prevented any prosecution of the sponsors and perpetrators of the violence. The protests were triggered by the concern that the president at the time, Macky Sall, was attempting to muzzle his opponents and seek a third term in office, despite being prevented by the Constitution. Sall denied seeking.
Precisely.
Thought-
Precisely. And you see the similarity, right? Between what Maki was doing and
and
between
January
what
6th.
the leader at that time in the United States was also trying to do. You see?
Yeah.
So now when you have amnesty, as I said in the beginning, the whole the reason for initiating it, right?
Yeah.
In the case of Senegal, was to cover the security forces. And you see the flip side here, right?
Yeah, correct.
Cover the security forces who were ordered basically by Macky Sall to carry out that policy, right?
Yeah.
So now he wants to pardon them, but nobody's going to allow a blanket pardon. And that's why he says both sides, because now he wants it to appear as if he's being even handed, right? The flip side here in the United States, you know, obviously the amnesty would be to exonerate, in this case, civilians, the civilians who are actually the ones who are committing violence in this particular case, including violence against security forces. You see,
Yeah.
it
That was
was the exact
captured.
opposite. You see, but in each case, the desire was to exonerate the supporters of each of those particular presidents at the time. In Senegal, it was security forces, supporters of the president, carrying out his orders at least, right?
Yep.
So his incentive was to exonerate them. In the US, it was the opposite. The violent civilians who were incited to violence by the president himself, right?
Yeah, correct.
So obviously, he felt obligated to exonerate.
Yeah. He did call them political prisoners.
Political prisoners, patriots, victims, victims and all. But he kept adjusting, of course, In the beginning, first he welcomed them, then he said some of them went overboard. And then depending on when he's speaking, he embraced all of them eventually as patriots.
So one question I glean from this is, judging by the reversal of this amnesty, would you say this is the governments of Bassirou Faye and Ousmane Sonko laying the groundwork of what it looks like for a truly democratic society holding the affairs of states to question? Because if you're clearly saying the tools of state should not be used as a suppression tactic, as a suppression mechanism against the people, and that they are not above the law, what are you saying to the wider African society with regards to the reversal of this law?
Well, I don't think they're totally reversing. I think they're amending it.
Yeah.
Which I support.
But in the grand scheme of things, normally when laws like this are passed, they often don't get a second look in. They just stay on the books.
Listen.
Yeah,
we have a government of young, serious, dedicated, leaders in Senegal, and so I hope that other African countries, other young people, are learning from what is happening in Senegal.
correct.
Just as many of these young leaders that we have learned from what happened in Burkina Faso when Sankara was the leader of Burkina Faso. You see? They know that government can be transformative, and government can only be taken as serious as the leaders take it as well.
Correct.
You know,
Mm.
in the beginning, I have mixed thoughts about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I don't think,
It's
the people the brutal killers of Steve Biko should qualify for any type of amnesty. You know, I think we are breeding impunity, you see, and people who committed crimes of that caliber. I think the principle itself was fine, but I think there should have been exceptions for certain crimes that exceeded the pale, and that particular, the brutal murder of Steve Biko was just one example of many that should not have qualified for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, number one. And then in retrospect, I don't think it was also correct to exonerate the crimes of apartheid in terms of the economic crimes committed, including the land. I've been reading, Sol Plaatje, Plaatje, Native Life in South Africa, which was published in 1916. It's a remarkable, remarkable book. It describes the Land Act of 1913. It's one of the few books written contemporaneously at that time by an African. He's not widely known. He should be much more known than he is. He was a journalist, an author. I think he was one of the first secretary generals of, I think initially was the African Native National Congress before it became the African National Congress. So if you read the accounts, he was a brilliant journalist because he was going there to see for himself, eyewitness. Because what happened is 1 million Africans all Africans were impacted, right?
Okay.
And 1 million were working on white-owned farms. 1 million, I guess you would count the workers and their families as well. And so they would lease the land from the white owners.
Almost like sharecropping.
Africans owned their land as well at the time. There were some that owned their lands, but there were 1 million who were leasing from these white farm owners. Okay. And then at the end of the year, they would split the produce 50-50. So both sides were accumulating. Wealth increasing for the European and the African, standard of life increasing every year. With the Land Act, it made it illegal for Africans to buy land except in the designated location for Africans. At that time, Africans made about 70% of the population. The European, mixed race, Indian was still relatively high at that time, relatively. Because now Africans make, 80% now. But even with the 70%, they were allocated 5%, 5.5% of the land, right? Number one. So in a designated location, barren land. So now every African, no matter where you are located, if you want land, you have to go to that consigned 5.5%. The ones who had been leasing in white-owned farms, they had two options. Since they could no longer lease. You either leave or you continue working, but this time as a servant for the white farmers. See, so the world was moving forward historically. People moving from slavery to serfdom to proletariat and owner of capital, right? You have workers. And South Africa, they were reversing the history. People who had been accumulating land, wealth by leasing and producing, were reverted back into serfdom. They became servants, essentially like slaves, paid labor, paid minuscule wages. That was number one option. And of course, in the land that they leased, they had their livestock, right? In some cases, hundreds of cattle, sheep, goats, and you name it. So now you don't own the land, you don't lease the land. What are you going to do? If you decide to remain there as a servant, you're going to sell your livestock for pennies to the European landowner. The second option was, of course, leaving, and many set out on the road in ox-drawn wagons with hundreds of cattle ahead of them, some in the winter, right? And he's describing in detail the cattle becoming emaciated. You don't even know where you're heading to, heading toward, what is now Botswana. Many of them died along the way, the people as well as the cattle. He describes accounts of, in one location, European farmers shooting the Africans, burying them, and taking over their livestock. In one account, he's describing a couple who was kicked off the land. So the elderly, then they had a baby who was sick, and they started traveling along the road. The baby died after a few days, so they had to secretly bury the baby along the roadside. It's just like, so it's like the Nakba, if you know the Palestinian Nakba. This is what they faced in South Africa. And this story is not widely told. And I know why now, because now you read this account and you become familiar with it, you say, no, there's no way this should have been exonerated. They should have been compensated. Compensated not only for the land stolen, compensated for the heads of the livestock stolen from them. And whether it's something that is paid over years, this should have been computed, you see?
Yep. So speaking of that, where the final story, we're actually going into South Africa, and it's a story that has been running, and I think it's about to come to a head. And it's from the BBC. And it reads, is the South African coalition government about to fall apart? The story is filed by...
I'm laughing because if you go back, and you look at our podcast around the time that the coalition was formed,
yeah.
I think we had that discussion, and I gave a prediction. I said, it's just a question of time, I said. I didn't know when.
Yes.
But I said this is what you call a government of national disunity,
Okay. I'll continue. And the story is filed in by Farouk Chiotia. It reads, South African coalition government is on shaky ground with the sharp divisions between its two biggest parties, the African National Congress, ANC, and Democratic Alliance, DA, exposed in a crucial vote on the national budget. The center-right DA voted against the fiscal framework, a key part of the budget, after rejecting an increase in VAT and demanding a cut in spending across all government departments. The ANC, which positioned itself as a center-left party, refused to bow to what it called the DA demand for an austerity budget. It demonstrated its political acumen by winning the support of a slew of smaller parties, both inside and outside government, to get the fiscal framework through Parliament by 194 votes to 182. The DA subsequently filed papers in court to challenge the vote, saying it was procedurally flawed, while its top leadership is due to meet later to decide whether or not to remain in what South African calls a government of national unity. Your initial thought before I finish up?
Well, it's the same contradictions that existed at the time that this coalition government was formed. which we discussed, I think, the week after it was formed, or maybe the same week when we had the show.
Yeah.
And I said, how can you have a marriage of parties with so diametrically opposed visions of South Africa? The Democratic Alliance does not support land reform.
Reform, yeah.
Right? Or land justice, I should call it. Okay. Right? They don't support that. They did not support economic empowerment for the historically deprived population, the African population. They didn't support that. So I didn't see how such a coalition, really could survive in the long run. And now they're going, obviously, to the same World Bank type solution. You just, cut jobs, right?
Yeah.
They're doing the Elon Musk solution that is being applied here in the United States. Just fire people, fire people. And that, of course, is not a policy that the ANC can pursue. It would be like political suicide for the ANC, given its waning fortunes in each election cycle. You can imagine what this would do to it by the time the next election comes around.
Yeah. Let me finish up. It says the coalition government was formed less than a year after ANC lost its parliamentary majority in elections for the first time since Nelson Mandela led it to power in 1994 at the end of white minority rule. Or hinting that the DA's participation is no longer certain, DA spokesman Willie Akmat accused the ANC of a serious infraction and said the party had crossed a line in the sand. DA's federal chair, Haley Zille, said the party would consider all its options and not rush into a decision. We know that being in a coalition requires compromise. You can get it all, but the ANC cannot get it all, and they are refusing point blank to share power, Zille added. The ANC took an equally tough stance with its parliamentary chief whip, Udimenesi Untuli, accusing the DA of complex betrayal by seeking to break ranks with its partner in Government of National Unity. President Cyril Ramaphosa's spokesman, Vincent Maguire, also threw down the gauntlet to the DA, saying, "You can't be part of a government whose budget you oppose." The DA found itself voting alongside South Africa's two biggest and most populist opposition parties, former President Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto Sigwe and Julius Malema's Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, advocating those two were advocating for the nationalization of the key sectors of the economy. These two parties are the implacable foes of the pro-business DA, but the three parties were united in opposing a VAT increase, believing it will hit the poor very hard. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very ironic, of course. As the article says, that now you have the DA voting on the same side against the ANC's proposal, together with the Economic Freedom Fighters of Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto party.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they do have to raise money. They have to raise money. And they're going to raise it by the taxes, or they're going to raise it by cutting services, meaning cutting jobs. And I see that as highly unlikely. Most likely, their approach is going to be some sort of tax
increase
structure. Now, I would have to look at be more familiar with the economy. Obviously, it will have impact because VAT, if it's across the board, it would affect, all products. I don't see why it should be, just a uniform rate. I mean, the food products, for example, you see, transportation, like, public transportation. I don't see why those should be taxed at the same rate as products that are mostly consumed by wealthier South Africans. So I think it should be targeted in such a way that those that pay actually are the ones that can afford to pay.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, everybody else always will say that, I can't afford to pay either. But there's some that are in a less adverse position than others. So that's how it should be balanced.
I couldn't help but, gathering the stories of failing to think that for some reason this week has felt like being on the animal farm.
I have one of his illustrated books as well. I have 1984 actually.
I have 1980. But I mean, Animal Farm, he was every time I read the story, I'm like, what is
So
okay?
a total classic,
Eh,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, up is down, down is up. The the
yeah.
concept of normalcy is turned
Mhm.
upside down. You can't help but think, from the tariff regime
No, but it
to
makes you think a lot. It makes you think
yeah,
about your own and society's definition of normalcy.
mm,
You
mm,
know,
mm,
things will never be the same. You know,
mm, mm,
uh, sometimes that's good, but in many senses, it's also not good based on what we're seeing. But as I said in the beginning, there is a readjustment ongoing in the United States. At the end of the day, empires are built based on accumulation
of power.
from external sources, right?
Yep.
And you build up the power. And you are on an ascendancy trajectory for quite some time. And then at the end of the day, there are changes that start occurring. And that's what we're seeing, my friend. No, really.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
we're seeing, we're seeing, in fact, you think about it this way. Obviously, I mean, it's upside down. For Trump to be seen as a savior shows you how desperate working people really are. But it worked because, as
Mm,
I was saying the other day,
mm,
if you have Republicans saying we're going to build a wall to keep these immigrants who
out.
are coming across the border and stealing our minimum wage McDonald jobs and therefore threatening our economy. That's the argument, right?
Mm,
Not the 1% that is accumulating all the wealth, right?
yep.
And and installing into place governments that keep focusing on tax cuts for the wealthy. Those are not the problem. It's those
It's yeah.
immigrants, streaming across the border. It's a Republican solution. We're going to build a wall. And the Democrats, what did they say? They essentially said, we're going to build a wall too. So if you have, these are the two parties that are the vision, then of course working people are in deep, deep trouble. And of
Mm,
course, Trump was coming in like the outsider, right?
yep.
So I am going to be for you working people by blocking these immigrants from coming in.
Wink, wink.
What kind of mindset has the working person been reduced to believe that, in fact, his biggest or her biggest enemy are indeed those people coming from across the border? Just think about
Exactly.
that. But it
Exactly.
worked. But it
Exactly.
worked.
Exactly.
It got him elected. So where are his working people friends now?
Hmm.
Is Elon Musk a working person? Is Elon a working person? See? But that is called a short-term gap. How many
And
times can you sell that, you know, that fiction? How many times really?
well,
So the emperor is being undressed, and we're living at that special period. As I said in the beginning, at one point, Great Britain was undressed. Gradually, they took until they left her with the panties, right? The US, that's now cutting. And new emerging uh, regions are coming up. And that's just how history is, you know?
I mean, the worst part is the Mr. Piggies created the illusion in the minds of America's boxers that if only they work hard, they can
Yep,
also be. No, I mean,
yep. No,
the
not really. I mean, that's why it remains a classic.
oh
You know,
gosh.
it remains a classic.
Hmm,
The power of propaganda, right?
hmm.
Here we are.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. We've come to the end of another episode of African News Review. Again, hit like, share, do subscribe. We also like to announce that we will be rolling out memberships. So support by joining memberships either on YouTube or Patreon to support the channel so that we can grow. The aim is not only to continue doing this, but also to invite voices from the African continent that would go out and corroborate the stories that we're running on. I mean, imagine what it would have been like if we had somebody in Lesotho to tell us what the people on the factory made of floors are thinking,
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, brother Milton.
Yes. I mean, we live in special times. And as I kept saying, we are seeing the emergence of new regions. And that's why people should pay close attention to what is going on in the alliance of the Sahelian states. They are doing what African countries should have been doing since decades ago,
Mm,
trying to take control over the resources, take control over the economic policy.
mm,
Because without economic liberation, you know, as we've seen the evidence, they've failed to exercise
yep,
political independence and political
yep.
sovereignty.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think if this journey continues, we're going to see more African countries adopting similar approach. And then we'll be able to see transformation over the next 5, 10 years going forward, real transformation. So that is my hope. And we will be here analyzing these stories on a regular basis. So please do support this podcast. Otherwise, see you all next week. A luta continua. The struggle continues.
And remember, stay off the farm. Yes.
Get your
Thank you very
copy.
yeah, get your copy actually, you would. And yes, thank you all for coming through and hit like, share, subscribe, and bring a friend that brings a friend. So thank you. And until next week, it's goodbye for now.